It's really a pleasure to have you all in here for this first session, recalibrating the European relations in the wake of the war of Ukraine. So we all hope that you will kind of illuminate us as to see where we are and where we are heading and what can we do to improve things in this extremely complicated period. We'll have an extraordinary panel for that in this occasion, and if I can find my papers, we'll be able to proceed. I will not add more things to what we said before, and so we'll go immediately to our participants. And in the first place, we have Luis Miguel Bueno Padilla, who is the spokesperson in Arabic of the European External Action Service. And well, he's a career diplomat, he's been posted in different countries, and now he's based in Beirut as the spokesperson, as I was saying, of the European Union, well, the European External Action Service, but in Arabic. And I really advise you that it's a good idea to hear at his speeches in Arabic. I would say extremely powerful and incisive and extremely convincing, I would say. So it's kind of a special novelty, because I think it is the first time that the European Union speaks directly to the Arab people, to the Arab societies in Arabic. Of course, some of the representatives, normal representatives in the countries speak Arabic, but they speak about the problems in their place, usually. But to have a spokesperson in Arabic representing the voice of the European Union every day, that's really a novelty. And I really admire Luis Miguel Bueno Padilla for the job he is doing. I know he's prepared a special presentation for that, and so we will watch and hear it with all our interest to get this kind of introduction to the subject. So thank you, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. In fact, I'm not sure the presentation is going to be on the screen, but I'm not sure because there was a glitch. But happy to be here. Without the presentation is here. I have it. I can explain to you from my computer. But I mean, instead of boring you with a PowerPoint, I think I'll just highlight a few issues. First of all, as the ambassador said, it's the first time that the EU has a dedicated person on a regional level to speak to audiences across the region in Arabic, from Morocco to Iraq, including the Gulf. And as I said to the ambassador, it's been a pleasure and honor, and also quite scary, in fact. It's quite scary because, it's a big responsibility. And every time I do an interview on media, Al Jazeera, Al Arabiya, whatever, I have to wind back or rewind and say, did I say something wrong? Did my phone ring? Do I have any WhatsApp from anyone in Brussels firing me? Because it could happen. You never know. Now, the first point I'd like to make is Ukraine has been the invasion of Russia in Ukraine has been a turning point, a major turning point for us. And I'm going to be speaking about communication more than policy, but on all fronts, right? As you know, the invasion of Ukraine has set off a dynamic that is unprecedented in EU's history. For the first time, the EU is supporting a third country militarily. The treaties of the EU are not don't allow the EU to do these things. NATO does these things, not the EU, European Union. So, Nadim was mentioning before, or somebody was mentioning the geopolitics, right? Geopolitically speaking, this is a massive thing. It's a massive turning point. Communication-wise, it's been a disaster. Okay, let me be frank with you, because you were frank. I'm going to be frank too. It's been a disaster. Why? Because of course, very few people in the region understand why we Europeans are, I would say, obsessed even with supporting the Ukrainians. When I started my interviews, and I did 150 interviews last year on Ukraine alone, in many channels, the same questions will come up. Okay, so you Europeans, you're supporting the Ukrainians. What about the Palestinians, right? The whataboutism. What about the Iraqis? You invaded Iraq. And I always say, well, we did not invade Iraq, excuse me. No, you did, you, the West, because they put you in the same box as the West. What about the Libyans? Well, the Libyans, you know, Gaddafi was killing people. We went with NATO. And what about the civilians that NATO killed? Well, so this question is being recurrent all throughout. The whataboutism, what about us? You know, we have many wars in our region. You never really care. We had a war in Syria where crimes, atrocities were committed, and we haven't seen the same level of commitment on the part of European countries towards accountability, towards ensuring that doesn't happen again, and so on and so forth. So when you're confronted with this criticism, you have to understand a bit how you are perceived in the region in the first place. And this is the presentation I have prepared for you, but I'll run through it really quickly. I don't want to be long, but just know that, in fact, the EU has a pretty good, or the EU is perceived in a good manner in this region. Now, for example, we have more than 50% of interviewees or polled citizens in the region perceive the EU as a positive actor. More than 55% perceive the EU as, or the EU agenda, or the cooperation between their country and the European Union, as being impactful. Morocco, for example, if you want to take a country, 77% that would describe the EU relation as very good. Palestine is the next, 75%. And then you go down and you get to Egypt, 39% only. The knowledge of the EU, right? If you go to the Maghreb region, Morocco, Algeria, Tunisia, it's pretty well known. You know, the people know what the EU is about. If you go to the Masrek region, in particular Syria, no one has a clue. I mean, very few people know what the EU is about. Lebanon a bit more. Jordan is the best. But if you go to Syria, Egypt, again, 25% of people know, 25%. Egypt is a massive market, a massive country. So, but when the war in Ukraine arrived, we polled with Gallup. We have a poll, a collaboration with Gallup, and we polled people. And it was surprising to see 23% of all interviewees thought that the reaction of the EU towards the war in Ukraine had impacted negatively on their perception of the European Union. And 26% did not change their perception. So more than 50% of people said, no, it's either negative or we don't really care. Which goes to the point that you mentioned. In fact, this is not a war, it's another European war. And the High Representative, Mr. Borrell, has been touring the world, right, and the region, in fact, saying, look, this is about international law. This is about international law and upholding the multilateral system. This is what we care about as Europeans. The European project is based on that. And the response he's getting, or he's been getting, is, yes, but why don't you, Europeans, uphold the system everywhere in the same manner? And in particular, the South African minister was quite eloquent in that sense when he went to South Africa. And again, second point I wanted to mention, the first is perceptions, very mixed and worsened by a reaction to Ukraine. The second point, and not to be too long, is disinformation. There's a massive battle going on in the region. It's called, Mr. Borrell calls it the battle of narratives. And I had the privilege of sitting down with Mr. Borrell, and I told him point blank, we're losing this battle, Mr. High Representative. We're losing it big time in the region. There's no way we can win it. You know why? Because I'm in Beirut. I'm driving to work. I listened to the radio a while ago. And what do I listen to? Sputnik Arabic. Mm-hmm. What do I listen to? RT Arabic. And all the disinformation narratives that the Russians are spreading across the region. And not only that, yesterday I was reading an article in the Sharq Awsat, which is a major newspaper, you know, based in London. And a very respected opinion or commentator, analyst, was saying, no, as you know, the Europeans and the Americans were training the Ukrainians years before this war happened. So therefore, you know, the Russians are right in saying, you know, we're defending ourselves. Anyways, what I'm trying to say is the Russians are present everywhere in the region and been there, and they're investing big time in having commentators, analysts in all channels. I will go to Al Jazeera, do my thing for 5 minutes. Before me and after me, there'll be a guy from Moscow, impeccable Arabic, propelling disinformation, lies, and so on and so forth, the narratives from the Kremlin. So, this is going on everywhere in the Arab world, and beyond Al Jazeera and Arabiya, the third major channel is RT Arabic in terms of audience in the region. So just imagine. Now, this has an impact on opinion polls, but it also has an impact on policy. States, there's not one single Arab state or in the Mediterranean region that is aligned completely with the EU thesis on Ukraine. Not one. You can name, you can challenge me on this. I can tell you whether or not that. In fact, some are not only that, but they're very ambiguous. They're not condemning the invasion, they're very ambiguous. Third point, and I'm going to finish here, Ambassador, is the reaction of the EU. What have we done? What are we doing? In fact, yours truly, I'm doing what I can in my little corner, but there is a lot to be done. In fact, we created a network of analysts, information analysts, that are scanning the infosphere across the region, right? From Morocco to Iraq and so on, and detecting anti-EU narratives and that try to feed into policy. We're trying to push a bit the boundaries. Ambassador Moran knows that the Brussels machinery is quite complicated and rigid, but it's true that we need to adapt. We cannot just expect others to follow. No, we need to understand and put ourselves in their place. And actually, the High Representative said that many of the countries share the same principles, but they have different priorities. Right? And so here, I'll finish with this, is, the idea now is to build, let's say, a consensus among communication experts in the EU, increase the content in Arabic, not to compete with the Russians, but to tell our own story. I think we should not shy away from telling the story. Why do we care so much about Ukraine? This is what I'm telling my friends, journalists across the Arab region is simple. This war is geographically in Europe. The European Union is a project that is about peace. Essentially, it's a project to solve or to avoid another massive war in the European continent, in the world. An Ukrainian goes to Poland, or a Polish go to Ukraine, in 3 months they'll be talking fluently the language. It's if I go to Italy. It is only normal that this elan, or this, let's say, solidarity happens towards the Ukrainian. It's not about blue eyes and as some people were saying in the region. This criticism, you're not taking the Syrians because they're Muslims and so on, and you're taking the Ukrainians because the Christians have blue eyes. Not exactly. It's about 4 member states of this project, peace project, that border Ukraine. And therefore, it's natural that 4 or 5 million people will go into the EU, and so on and so forth. So, long story short, you have to explain. There's a pedagogical effort to be made here. And in this sense, you have to break a bit the boundaries of the rigid communication that we have in the EU, and try to a bit push the limits in terms of engaging with audiences in the Arab world. And I think I'll end there.
The energy landscape and the interests of priorities of the different stakeholders in this complicated business, whenever oil, energy, and geopolitics get mixed together. This is usually a very explosive situation. How can you help us to understand it better?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for inviting me. And just a correction that I've been promoted like 5 years ago to the executive director or the MENA director at NRGI. Anyway, just that. But it brought me back to the years when I was trying to understand the region and oil and gas, etc., and the energy transition. Anyway, just one thing to add on what Luis had said about the narratives. Just one thing that is happening at least in Lebanon, it's Sputnik, Russia Today, they're buying airtime. Exactly. So because the radios are in financial problems, so they're accepting that, or some televisions, because they have financial struggles, so they are taking that money and agreeing on airing what the narrative is. So that's something that the EU needs to look at to see if Deutsche Welle was doing something like that, buying airtime and doing that. So that is one model that they can look at just to fix things. So it's not out of conviction. Sometimes it's more out of necessity and finances. And even on energy, and we'll come to that, even on energy transition, it's out of necessity sometimes that countries are moving to renewables more than anything else. We'll discuss that. So to tackle the issues, so definitely the Russia invasion of Ukraine had was an energy story as well. And definitely it exposed the European dependence on the Russian gas and energy big time. And European citizens had to be faced with that reality. The second reality that they had to face, it's like this ideology or a theory or the concept that they based on their model for years, that interdependence, economic interdependence would lead to stability. Especially that was something that the Germans were pushing for at the EU level, that as long as we involve the Russians economically into that big picture, so they will be stabilized or neutralized. And we've seen that that concept had been really put into question because we've seen that there are certain thresholds that once you get past that threshold, like this interdependence didn't make much. On the contrary, Russia used that weapon against Europe. So Europe was facing an existential problem, which kind of brought them all together, because there was a lot of skepticism that the Europeans, this is a very fragmented machinery, bureaucratic, they take time to take action, etc. So everybody will freeze in Europe. So that was it, like they will not be able to take decisions, and then the European continent in winter, they will be freezing. So they had mild winter, but more than the mild winter, it was like they really worked really hard on putting regulations, policies that really made them go through 2022, 2023 with success. So at least that really brought them together to work really strong on putting all the regulations that saved the day. But at the same time, I guess the energy security issue floated back, and energy transition was a bit put under as a second ranking, but never forgotten about that. So suddenly it was about energy security for the short term to medium term, but without forgetting the energy transition, long-term policies that they had and the targets that they had. Because some were saying in the region, like, look at them now, suddenly they want our gas, they want our oil, they forgot everything about energy transition, which is not the case. So they had that in mind, but directly they needed to find solutions for their imminent problems, because the decision was taken to end the dependence on Russian gas, and they were really successful in doing so. And they reduced their consumption, and they reduced their need of the Russian gas, and this is something that is amazing to see what Europe has done. So basically, and the International Energy Agency now is saying that this push for energy security doesn't mean that less to do on energy transition. On the contrary, energy security now means independence, and independence means more deployment of renewable energy, which is produced in the countries, which will give them a sense of independence. And therefore, energy security today is linked more onto energy transition than even before. So this is what was happening on the European side. So this immediate need for gas and other products made them look into the neighborhood. So who's the neighborhood? Who's the closest? Definitely, there was visits to North Africa. So basically, it was North Africa mainly, East Mediterranean, so where Egypt and Israel, Lebanon are, and Syria, and then to the Gulf. So this is how they divided their approach to finding immediately solutions and to replace a certain percent of the Russian gas by the neighborhood gas and oil products. So basically, you've seen parallel tracks. Individual countries, mainly Italy, taking action directly, going to North Africa, direct, and going to Algeria, making deals with Algeria, billions of dollars to be invested in oil and gas, plus on renewables and plus on energy transition project. But mainly they were going there to ask for more gas so that they help them into using less of the Russian gas. They went to Libya as well. So They used all the historical card that they had. So ENI with the Prime Minister going hand in hand to North Africa, talking to Sonatrach, talking to the Algerian government, talking to Libya, talking to the National Oil Corporation there to make sure that there are projects, there is investment going to go into investing into the oil and gas sector, but at the same time investing in renewables and investing in decarbonizing even the oil and gas sector, which is one of the issues that the oil and gas companies think they should be doing, like, yes, continue producing, but at the same time decarbonize that, so make it less emissions from that sector. So this was the immediate action that was taken by Italy. At the same time, the European Commission was playing an active role as well. So President von der Leyen with Commissioner Kadri Simpson went to Egypt. They signed an MOU with Egypt, Israel, saying that we want the Israeli gas to flow through the Egyptian infrastructure to come to Europe. At the same time, the Lebanese, the Israelis were fighting for a decade over a maritime border issue. Suddenly, because of Ukraine, Russia, it was becoming a security issue, an important issue, national security. So France was pushing for it. The Americans used that card, like saying, like, you guys, once you do the deal, you Israelis are going to sell your gas to the European, and you Lebanese, you'll become so rich that you will not, some were saying they will not need the IMF program. This is in Lebanon, but like encouraged by the European Union, encouraged kind of by the Americans as well. So a deal was made. Decade-long dispute was made possible because of the Russia-Ukraine war. So on the other side, for years and years, the European Union was fighting long-term contracts on LNG and gas. And suddenly it became possibility, and Qatar signed a deal for 15 years of gas to be sent to Germany. So these were the landscape, these were the changes that we're seeing. Suddenly we're seeing that rush to the neighborhood to bring more gas, but at the same time being really true to the energy transition pledges, to be frank with them, because on every contract that was signed, on every MOU that was signed, there were a lot of language around energy transition because they want to maintain the thing. So two points, and I'll stop there. So basically to understand, because we're talking about this relation, so there is going to be more energy relations in the region between Europe and the neighborhood, the immediate neighborhood, and even like with the Gulf as well. So, and we are seeing this pivot by the European Commission on having more of strategic dialogue, having more of strategic spaces for the EU GCC countries. Talking about energy transition, talking about hydrogen, talking about like renewables, talking about many things related to energy. But more importantly, so that we speak the same language. Because sometimes we speak a language, they speak, and the European Union speaks another language. For the European Union, maybe the energy transition issue is a climate issue, is an environmental issue. It's not the same for the region at all. Tunisians will tell you, I want more solar panels, I want more solar energy, from renewable energy from solar, because it's a national security matter. Today, I cannot provide electricity anymore to my people. I cannot afford buying that electricity. So for countries in the region, they cannot afford anymore importing the fuel that is very expensive. It's becoming expensive, and because they're financially pressured, their budgets are on deficit. And so it is a matter of national security to be able to go for something that is maybe homemade, that will create jobs, at the same time will be less expensive than importing. So this is something important. For the producing countries in the region, they want to have more solar energy or renewable energy for the electricity, not because of the climate and everything. It's because they need to spare the capacity, to have the spare capacity of selling more of their gas that will keep producing, to bring in foreign currency, to be able to provide to the social stability in the countries. So it's completely different why they are going into energy transition. It's completely different why they want to deploy more renewables. And this is what you need to understand. It's not about climate. So if you keep on talking to them about climate, they know it's getting hotter in the cities, but they are going into renewables because it's about social contract, it's about social stability, it's about financial pressures, and it's not about the environment. So it's important to understand what are the incentives of each. My final point on that is, again, because we were discussing, and I agree with Nadim about this vision for the Mediterranean, And more importantly, I think it's for a vision for us in the Middle East. Mediterranean, so and the three divided, North Africa, Eastern Mediterranean, and the Gulf. We are in a very, very sad situation. Morocco, Algeria, they're fighting. So this is a problem for Europe. You want the green energy from Morocco and you want oil and gas from Algeria. If these two countries are fighting, they want you to take position. What position are you going to take? Because you need the energy, both energies. Tunisia is defaulting. Libya, no one knows what's happening there, forgotten. Dispute, not dispute. So even if Italy wants to get their gas, they don't know at any point that it could stop because they could fight like each other, like the divisions inside the country that no one is solving. Egypt is everybody knows what the economic situation is in Egypt, but how much money you are going, or the Gulf is going to keep on putting money into the central bank to stabilize it, because these are like 100 million people that might like be left in a chaotic situation. Palestine, even Israel, like this existential problem that they have, and every Saturday and going fighting for the existence of Israel and the spirit of what they created. Lebanon, failing. Syria, failing. Iraq, because now they have money, they're stabilizing. If we have like a decrease in money in the oil prices, they will have problems because their economy is just standing on oil and gas, which is not going to be something that people would want in 2050. What will happen to the Iraqis? Because they need to live beyond 2050. Yemen, completely collapsing. So who is standing in the Gulf, in the region now? It's Saudi Arabia and the UAE, and the satellite around them, and Qatar to some extent. It cannot be that three countries only are having like an economic boom, and the rest of the region is doomed. So it doesn't work that way. So the vision is like, how can we create that vision in the region? And this is where it comes helpful with the EU. You created that vision of a united European continent. So how can we do? I've never seen anyone talking about this. Can we bring the Arab countries together, or the Middle East countries together, to work together to create that economic force, that social force, etc.? So it is a big challenge. So this is where the work should be with the EU on how to create that vision among ourselves. So the Arab League needs to be boosted to become an inspiring league, not to become that place where they go, I don't know what they do, and then everything is prepared, and then they just go do this, the theater, and then they read this statement at the end, and that's it. It cannot work. It cannot work. So there is a vision for the region among ourselves in the Mediterranean, in the Middle East, and then to be able like to talk to the Europeans on a level of vision to vision, or on a level of more of collaboration. But now it cannot be you just give us money so that we stay in our countries, we don't come to you. It doesn't work anymore. Thank you.
So thank you very much, Laury. Really, thank you for bringing us the vision from the other side, because it is true that some people are working on that, as Luis Miguel is doing. But he represents the voice from the north, although he is at the same time someone who is there, looking around and telling us what can be seen with European eyes. But you brought us the other side of the coin, the other perspective, and we have realized once more that energy is a key point in many different respects, and is especially a key point in geopolitics, but not only that. It's a key point in, as you said, in many countries of the social contract and the stability, political and social stability in the countries. And now we turn to another perspective to the issue with Ambassador James Moran. James Moran is a career diplomat. He's been working on the area for many years, and mainly we invited him because he's a close friend of the IEMed, working with us very often on these kind of affairs. And he was the European Union ambassador to Egypt in a recent period, and so he can explain his point of view, what's going on, what's the impact of the war in Ukraine in South and East Mediterranean countries, and what has that changed in the perspective of the European Union? How should we therefore adjust our policies to cope with these new immense challenges? So, James, you have the floor. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador, and how nice it is to be back in beautiful Barcelona. And thank you to you and the authorities for giving us this fantastic venue today. I must say it's very impressive, very nice. Nice to be here, although outside there in the region, in the Mediterranean, things are not quite as peaceful and elegant perhaps as they are here. We should, of course, all keep that in mind. The title of this session is Recalibrating Relations in the Wake of the War in Ukraine. Well, in the wake of, we're not actually in the wake of it yet, we're in the middle of it. And I listened very carefully to Nadim Houri earlier on, and Vasco as well, talking about this. And I agree, there is a need to dream, much as I think happened here in Barcelona back in the mid-90s. There was a dream back then. A new dream probably is needed. However, it's a bit difficult to dream when you have a nightmare going on your doorstep from the European perspective, which of course is the Ukraine war. The thing is that whether the bandwidth politically is there right now in Europe to have that sort of dream, to move ahead, have greater strategic clarity, whether it's there so long as we have the war in Ukraine going on, I really don't know. I would hope so, because the so-called southern neighborhood, and I think that term, by the way, has run its course. We have to move on from it, but I think the partner countries of the region need a great deal more thought and attention than they're getting at the moment. And I think we're treading water. But there are reasons for this, and I think it is understandable if you look at the broader situation, particularly vis-à-vis Ukraine. In terms of context, I think okay, people talk about Ukraine as being a turning point. There's another turning point, which is very important for the region. And that is the acceptance that Mr. Assad takes up his seat in Cairo at the League of Arab States. I think I say that because that, to me, marks the end of the so-called Arab uprisings. I'm not going to use the word Arab Spring. I don't think we need to do that, but nevertheless, it is the definitive end of the story. We were almost at the end a year or two ago with the developments in Tunisia, which have been extremely negative, I think, for that country, but nevertheless, we have now reached it with Syria. Now, okay, and since I mentioned Syria, we then move on a little bit to the new context, and the context of what everybody refers to as geopolitics. The European Union was not created to deal with spheres of influence, Westphalian sorts of maneuvering and so on, which we now see going on very much in this region and around the world. But it's having to learn on the job. And it is, to some extent, doing that. If you would have told me when I was representing the Union overseas years ago that European Union taxpayers' money would be used to supply lethal weaponry to anybody, I would have told you to go away. That's just not in the DNA of the European Union, I would have said. Well, not anymore. We now see that there is a major effort going on to supply Zelensky and his troops with lethal weaponry, now being used, as we see on our television screens, in the eastern part of Ukraine. So there is a learning experience that's going on, and it needs to be accelerated, especially in the region, in the MENA region, and indeed in the Gulf, when we look at what others are doing. In that context, we see, of course, the Russians entrenched in many places. Most recently, we've seen their influence, malign influence on the situation in Sudan, where Mr. Hemeti's forces are supported by Wagner and their gold mining interests. But we also see that Russia's ability to project power in the region has been pretty well hampered because they are tied up themselves with their effort, with their invasion in Ukraine. And I think on the whole, if you look around the region, regardless of the fact that they're building nuclear plants in Egypt and a few other things that's been going on, I think the Russian influence has probably peaked. They seem to be a little bit on the back foot. It would make sense when you look at the big picture, given the trouble they have militarily in the Ukraine theater. On the other hand, China, nobody's spoken about that yet, but China is, of course, a highly influential actor now in the region. I mean, apart from Belt and Road, it is now, I think, and IEMed will know this very well, it is now, I think, on a par with European Union trade in MENA and indeed in the Gulf, almost everywhere. I think in some countries it's overtaken the EU as the #1 trading partner. Certainly that's true in the UAE. It does that, of course, as we know, to protect its interests, its economic interests and so on. But more importantly, there is also the move of China into the political field, which I think is fascinating, what is going on at the moment with first the Saudi-Iranian rapprochement, which was, of course, brokered by China. It was going on, we know, for many years beforehand in Oman and elsewhere, but it was the Chinese that provided the diplomatic muscle for that very important agreement to be made and to patch up to some extent the situation between Saudi Arabia and Iran. Good news, possibly, I think, for the Yemen conflict. Wouldn't it be nice to see one of these conflicts around the region actually reaching some sort of solution, some sort of outcome, rather than just grinding on and on and on? Perhaps this will help that situation. I know the UN envoy Hans Gunberg is quite optimistic, and he's got reasons, I think, to be so. China's also said it wants to be more active in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, yet to specify quite how that would be. Mahmoud Abbas is going to Beijing, I think, as we speak. I think he's leaving today. He'll spend 3 or 4 days over there. First trip in many, many years. It's an interesting one. Of course, I mean, I think China does this as much to poke the United States in the eye, and to some extent the Europeans as well, but primarily the US, rather than to be terribly serious about a new peace plan for that tragic part of the region. Where is the EU on the Middle Eastern situation? I'm sorry, it really is, you mentioned, one of you, I think earlier, the problems between France and Italy over Libya, but when we look at the situation of the EU on Palestine, it's very depressing. We used to be able to speak more or less with one voice. These days, it's very, very difficult. You have a group of countries, not just the Visegrad lot, but some others too, who frankly make it very, very difficult for the EU to have any meaningful position. Mr. Borrell is left high and dry very often, having to make his own declarations, not on behalf of the member states, when it comes to the Palestinians. And you've got the far-right Netanyahu government with Mr. Smotrich and Ben-Gvir running around talking about ejecting the Palestinians, killing the Palestinians, wiping out their villages and so on. And the EU, I'm afraid, has been pretty well cowed in response. The Americans have actually pushed back harder on these issues than Europe has. We have a real problem there. We've got to get to it. But look, we also support in Europe the so-called Abraham Accords as being a way towards peace in the region. Well, that's all very well, but I'm frankly wondering what on earth value do these accords have so long as you have the Palestinian issue out there getting worse and worse with every passing month, with the possibility of a third intifada down the track. And as for the Saudis signing something, the Americans are trying to, of course, facilitate that. It's going nowhere, and the Americans have been told, I know this directly, have been told a week or so ago in Saudi Arabia at the highest level, forget it, there's no way we're going to sign anything with Israel so long as these people are behaving the way that they are in the Middle East. And then you have, of course, a quick word on Turkey, because we've just had the election there. Turkey, of course, as we all know, is a big player, not least in Eastern Mediterranean gas and oil. And there are many, many issues, too many to talk about now, vis-à-vis Europe and indeed the rest of the region. We've got Erdogan still trying to make Turkey great again, but I think he's in a much weaker position after the election. The country was pretty well divided, and his economy is in smithereens. Much needs to be done to put Turkey back on track at home, and this, I think, will have some consequences for the way that we in Europe and the rest of the region deals with Turkey. That being said, Turkey is a big factor. So you have, and of course you have the Saudi Arabians and the Emiratis themselves projecting power in the region. It really is an extraordinarily, you use the word complicated, it's even more complicated than it was before. How to deal with all of that? Where does it leave Europe and the European neighborhood policy in this new context? Well, if you look to that, I think we have a serious problem. The current direction of travel on the neighborhood policy, I think, is circular. It seems to be going round in circles. I'm not sure very much is being achieved right now. The new investment plan, the so-called 30 billion euro that was supposed to be raised under the new agenda of 2021, some progress has been made on that, especially when it comes to green investments and so on around the region, but I think there's a long way still to go. The point about value chains, reshoring, friendshoring out of China and the Far East into North Africa and elsewhere, that didn't go too well, not surprisingly, because although there are some successes, Morocco comes to mind, overall, competing with China on value chains is turning out to be almost impossible. Most European companies prefer to stay with what they know and stay with the high levels of productivity, even if the labor costs are higher in China. So that's not going too well. Yes, the green transition stuff is working to an extent, but there was nothing in the new agenda, and there still is nothing on the European side in terms of concessions on trade and investment, especially trade, and agricultural trade in particular. Nothing is being done on that front. And I don't think anything will be done anytime soon. The European Commission seems to be distracted at the moment. But until you give a little bit more flexibility to trade, and especially on agriculture, many countries of the region are not going to want to engage on all of that. Reforms, well, there's much to be done. We all know that in the region. The so-called policy dialogue that was proposed in the new agenda continues. Some successes there, but not a lot. It's very hard to get reform when you have the regimes that you now have in the region, not least those that with a military color. You see this in Egypt above all, where essentially it's a very protectionist mentality that you're dealing with. It's very hard to open up trade when you have that sort of mentality on the other side of the table, and that's not about to change. It may have to change because the Egyptians are in such a mess they've had to go back to the IMF and promise to get the military out of the economy. Inshallah. It's been promised before by Mubarak and others way back. They've never actually managed to do it. I hope they do, because if they don't, the country is going to be in an even worse situation a year or two down the track. 100% now of GDP as debt. It was half of that when I was serving in Egypt. But for the European point of view, we have to be very careful. We need Egyptian gas. Laury has been telling us about that. We need Lebanese gas, we need Algerian gas, we need whatever we can get. So in terms of how we deal with these problems under the new agenda, it's not so easy. Corruption, big problem. The IEMed survey brought that out a year or two ago. Well, it's a long list, but it isn't going... migration, finally, one word on migration. I see that Mrs. von der Leyen was in Tunis, I think, yesterday. I think she was supposed to be there. I wasn't able to check, but I think she was, to present this new policy which has just been agreed. The Italians came over, and now we have a brand new, well, not brand new, but it's being talked about for quite some time, arrangement for the migration problem. We'll see how that goes. But again, what's driving it is not a vision, it's not a dream. It's very transactional. It's keeping people out of Europe. It's not enough. This is a very defensive agenda. It's not a proactive one. Where's the dream? Going back to Nadim's point, it's not there at the moment. Now, I think I'm going to finish this off, because otherwise I can talk about it all day, and we all can. I suspect that the neighborhood approach and concept has run its course. I think the time has come to consign it to history. It was essentially a Eurocentric idea right from the beginning. A Eurocentric idea primarily for the East, and everybody then said 10, 15 years ago, ooh, what about the South? Barcelona process is going nowhere, let's have something new. And everybody thought, well, perhaps it's a good idea, it might release more resources, it might give more attention to the South. So let's tack on, and it really was a tack on, a residual to the overall neighborhood idea, which is that with the white people with blue eyes, we can add the Mediterraneans and we can make it into one big package. It never worked. It never worked. It was never going to be that way. It was hard enough before before we had this period after the end of the Arab uprisings. There was a brief period during the Arab uprising when it looked as though it might make a difference, but I don't think it's making its difference now. We essentially have a normative idea that they want to be more like us, masquerading as a transactional process right now with the neighborhood policy. It's neither one thing nor the other. It's neither fish nor fowl. It's neither chalk nor cheese. It's time to move on from it. The question is, and we need greater strategic clarity in order to be able to do that. The question is, how do we do that? And how can it be a process which is better adapted to the new context of how to engage with the great powers, how to engage competitively and also cooperatively, not only the United States, of course, but as I said, above all, less Eurocentric in conception. I don't think there's any easy answer. The IEMed is working, I know, on many ideas, and thank God it is, because it's one of the few places which is giving the right sort of attention to these issues. There are other discussions going on in Brussels and think tanks and so on. But I think, for the moment, the bandwidth isn't there. It's more a nightmare than a dream, Nadim, unfortunately, right now. Thank you. I'll stop there.
Okay, so thank you. Thank you for illuminating our way to look at it from this, from your experience, mainly in Middle East and specifically Egypt. They don't deny it. Of Russia in Ukraine, how distant attitude was taken by most of, well, by all, in fact, South and East Mediterranean countries and the Arab world in general, and the global South in general. And so that's again another strike in our way of seeing things.
Not only as a consequence, they could at some point not afford to import their needs for self-sufficiency in contexts that already suffer food in these contexts just to date. I mean, don't have access to electricity full time and still suffer power outages and very frequent power cuts. So this status quo that I described has, what it did is that it slowed down the COVID-19 recovery, the recovery from COVID-19. And it came indeed to overlap with other crises, including a global one that we don't tend to forget about, but that we don't speak about more often, which is the manufacturing supply chain from China. The manufacturing supply chain from China, because China did not recover, especially from COVID-19, because of its overstretched COVID policies, and until now, the Chinese economy hasn't recovered. As a result, more than 1/3 of the Arab population are currently under the poverty line. Unemployment exceeds 12% on average, this including the GCC. So if we are to take the non-GCC, to exclude the non-GCC, that will be on the upper bound even more. And the unemployment rate for youth is more than twice the regional unemployment rate, and both rates are more than twice the world average. So it is a very bleak diagnostic indeed. Now, even multidimensional inequality was exacerbated, and the cleavage between the southern shore, the southern part of the basin and the northern part of the basin was widened. And so the gap was widened between resource-rich and non-resource rich countries, and this is what was already actually mentioned. So what did this do? What it did is that it exposed the reliance, like the heavy reliance on Russia as the world's gas station, and on Ukraine as a key supplier of food primary resources. It exposed the fact that the Euro-Mediterranean region is always it's not homogeneous, but the southern Mediterranean is on the receiving end. However, this shock was transitory. We have to admit that the supply chain has already started to adjust. It has already started to recover somewhat. Now we can see that the Mediterranean is flooded, as it was mentioned, by the oil and gas from the GCC. So GCC and oil exporting countries like Algeria, we can see them benefiting from the inflationary spikes, making more revenues. They're happy. And we can see a diversification in the supply chain. We can indeed see that. And we can sense that there is a political will from the EU member states to actually move in that direction, to actually benefit from the diversification of the supply chain, of the proximity to the GCC, and to actually use the GCC as an alternative market, although this is not disclosed or this is not admitted publicly. And in addition to the GCC, this has been reflecting in Morocco and in Turkey in the boom in the car industry, for example, just recently. So this is reflective of this fact. What does this say? This lends proof to the fact that the Euro-Mediterranean region is very interconnected, as it was mentioned earlier. It is very interconnected. However, despite being interconnected, it is most disintegrated. And this constitutes the central idea of the remaining of my presentation, being most interconnected but most disintegrated. Now, indeed, many geopolitical developments have been taking place. Like we can mention, to enumerate a few, the Abraham Accord, the maritime deal between Lebanon and Israel, the Saudi-Iranian deal with China being the mediator, as it was mentioned, with Syria being back to the League of Arab States and the naturalization with the Syrian regime. We can see many geopolitical changes happening. It's because of the environmental goals and aims that have been initially set, but it's because we want to get rid of this reliance on oil and gas from, for example, the GCC and from Russia. So we want to go for an economic alternative. And when it comes to social justice, as the EU is dealing with democratic or political issues, with the energy transition, socioeconomic factors and elements are in oblivion. They're being forgotten about. The reason here takes me back to the central idea that I had mentioned, that we're interconnected but disintegrated, and that there is a very large spillover effect between the different economies. So, for example, a slight improvement in the Syrian economy will have a positive spillover effect on Lebanon, although we don't like to admit that, and so on and so forth, etc. For examples. The second reason is actually what Nadim Houri mentioned and what Laury reiterated. It is the lack of a clear and unified strategic vision for engagement with the southern neighborhood on the part of the EU. It's lacking this. And by lacking this, it is also lacking the standard, systematic, participatory processes that are like on a macro level, not surgical. For example, in Lebanon, there is the 3RF program, whereby indeed the EU is trying to consult with civil society organizations. But if we are to look at the global picture, we do not see these processes. And when it's consulting, it's not consulting with the knowledge-producing civil society. It is consulting with the implementing civil society that take the form or that have this like NGOization trait. Regarding EU's role amid the current status quo, to wrap this up, I need to mention three ideas, sorry. And then I'll wrap up. So basically, just to wrap this up and to give you the essence from a forward-looking perspective, because I dwelled so much on the diagnostic, and I'm sure you agree why, or you understand why is it so. The EU's role under the current status quo from a socioeconomic perspective, I think if you are to identify priority areas, 3 priority areas, and these were mentioned: trade, migration, and the financing or the aid. From a trade perspective, the EU should help the southern Mediterranean countries rationalize their imports, shift away from the export-led approach in many economic sectors, like in agriculture, and also to contain and keep control of the prices of goods and services domestically. So to do that, the EU should rethink its free trade agreements. And this predates the crisis. This predates the EU crisis. The war on Ukraine. But it does need to rethink the free trade agreements in Morocco and in Tunisia. Instead of doing this, it is now thinking of expanding this model to Egypt. So, and how is this hampering those economies or the good of these economies? The quotas, it's controlling the quotas, the tariff floors, the tariff ceilings, what they import, what they export. So it is coming to the detriment, or it's deterring the economic competitive advantage of these economies, not allowing them to actually improve or recover. On the migration side, we know that there is like this huge saturation in Europe with the Ukrainian refugees, and we know that the asylum seekers from Syria have exponentially increased in the past few years. I'm gonna skip the statistics to make it shorter, but in general, also from Syria, from Syrian neighboring countries, and from different Arab countries, we see that amid the current socioeconomic situation that is very bad, instead of protesting, we're seeing people migrating. So they changed strategies. Now they just want to migrate. The EU is somewhat more resources from the GCC and from the South. Instead, the EU should rethink its financing practices, because it is the financing practices that reflect EU's position vis-à-vis migration. What EU is trying to do is, and here I'm using Laury's words, it is trying to stabilize systems that are very chaotic in the Arab region, especially in host communities. They're trying to stabilize those systems, to keep them in power, and to give band-aid to both the host communities and to the refugees, so that they stay where they are and they do not go back or they do not come to Europe. This is what it is doing. It should definitely rethink this approach. And this takes me to the last point, which is the financing question, in climate financing. Climate financing is very important, and this is a starting point to think of climate action from a justice perspective, instead of co-opting it by speaking about the role of the private sector and the role of private financing. Climate financing, the way it is being used now, it's used as credit swaps. So we use climate finance to cancel all debt. And this is very unfair, because the debt that was accumulated already by the southern Mediterranean countries was accumulated on the old system and the current system, which is very inequitable. It was accumulated because of different practices that we know of that I'm not gonna go into. So instead, the EU should help change this model and turn the climate financing into the benefit of the southern countries, because it is a very precious opportunity, honestly. And it should help from a consultative perspective and from a funding perspective, it should help the southern countries in their debt restructuring and in how they spend the debt. It should increase the ODA, the Official Development Assistance. Okay, I'm gonna stop. I can carry on later, probably. should I?
Finish.
Yes, to finish, I'm gonna just enumerate. It should increase its provision of ODA, and it can do that because it has got more than 20% of the total voluntary contributions to the OECD. The EU has, in terms of voting power, its share is more than 21% of the IMF total quota. So the EU can really help us do the lobbying on the level of the IMF in its financing approach when it comes to the conditionalities that entail austerity, privatization, and interest rate surcharges. If they control 21%, they do have voting and lobbying power. So this is one thing. And it should also play a role in positive conditionality or in benign conditionality. We have seen success stories when it comes to that. For example, the World Bank forced the Lebanese government through the first social safety net program, and the second to build building blocks for a universal social registry. That would never be a political will to do that without the donors exerting this positive conditionality. In Egypt now, they're exerting a positive conditionality in this, on the level of not handing the economic activity over to the military anymore. And we're seeing improvements. I don't know if these will last, I doubt, but we're seeing improvements. So basically, yeah, I can stop here now for real. Thank you. Thanks for allowing me to actually carry on.
So thank you very much, Farah,
Lots
for
of energy,
bringing
that's
us to the ground and to see which are the socioeconomic consequences of things that we usually look at from a very general perspective, geopolitical or macroeconomic, forgetting what's the reality on the ground and the impact on the lives of people. But I admit that it's difficult to put in 10 minutes time as many ideas as you wanted to put forward. So we'll invite you to put it in written form, and we will publish it so that I do not feel so much guilty to stop you. So thank you very much. You deserved really have a coffee break, but I cannot spare giving the possibility, if anyone wants to put a question or a comment. Well, oh yes, so the anxiety to put the question is stronger than the desire for coffee. That's good.
Sorry, Go ahead.
No. Sorry to keep you away from your coffee for a couple of minutes, but
I'm sorry.
But this has been such an outstanding panel that I could not let you go. I simply could not let you go, and I would actually ask questions to each of you, but of course. The president is looking at me and saying no, because we have to go to the coffee, we have to keep the program. So I only have one question, because many of you, either you come from or you traveled from Beirut, or you have a Lebanese background. And of course, I mean, many of you have referred to the ongoing situation in Lebanon. And we cannot let it go. I mean, in the next session, we will probably focus more on the Maghreb countries. But of course, thinking about what you just now outlined, Farah, I mean, all the policy measures that we will try to, well, if you have the time to put them into paper, well, to convey them to the decision makers. But how can we move on if the state is vanishing? Because the current situation in Lebanon, unlike the situation, because Lebanon has always had different crises. It's like you spoke about circularity, but we can also speak about different cycles. But the current situation in Lebanon is probably much worse than what we have seen before. So how can you really implement, not all of them, but some of them, when the state is really vanishing?
Yes. Should I go ahead?
So
I'll go ahead, and I'm sure Laury might have more ideas to add. Basically, it is very difficult, because there is no political will at all to, I mean, there is no political will, and they do not see this, I mean, the Lebanese government does not see this as a priority, and we are still in a situation of a political deadlock, in my opinion. So this is very difficult. Now, given this de facto situation, that it is difficult and probably impossible, like, for example, as we try to advocate for universal social protection, we know that this is totally against the complex political economy of the Lebanese government to have a universal social protection. So we know this is not possible. So the solution is to take it one policy at a time, one step at a time, one decree at a time. So we're trying to make improvements on the level of programs, of policies, one by one. And here comes the role of the EU, of international donors, and of translate actors like the ILO, like UNICEF, like the UNDP, and many that are playing this intermediary role. The funding is being channeled to the government through them. They're implementing. So I mentioned the negative side of that, but it is, for the time being, given the current situation, it is what it is. The second is actually this positive conditionality. Because you are giving them money, as in the EU or the donors, because they are giving money to the government, then they can force the government to make some governance reforms. They can they should impose monitoring and evaluation and transparency and accountability mechanisms. Like, for example, when the IMF gave the SDRs to the Lebanese government, the central bank to manage the SDRs. They did not, they did not usually, so they did the same standard process that is being adopted globally, not to give any conditionality, not to give any transparency and accountability mechanisms as to how to spend them. They should, in my opinion.
Okay.
Can I
Thank you.
just
Yes,
add one point?
anyone of the panels, any final comment or
Yes.
reflection?
So again, just to give you an example of how the politics and the real politics that Nadim maybe was talking about, how the EU is dealing with this situation. So basically, the EU has delegated the powers to solve the crisis or to find the solution, whatever, to France. And France is playing a very negative role. I'm sure like Farah will agree, or anyone that is in this
Yes.
room, and this Lebanese will agree with that. So I'm sorry to say that France is playing a very bad role in trying to seize the opportunity of the crisis to advance its own economic and political agenda in the country and this is really bad for the people that are suffering in the country. So maintaining good, strong relations with the de facto powers in the country that a lot of Lebanese are fighting is something that will never be forgotten by the Lebanese of what Mr. Macron has done. So basically what they're doing, it's like under the name of stabilizing the country, and they don't want migration or migrants to go. France is advancing its own agenda in the country. And so basically there are deals that were made for the port, acquisition of some of the assets in the port, so-called by French-Lebanese company, the Liban Post, whatever, the Post of Lebanon, again the same company. There are talks about other as well, like sectors that are being overtaken by the same company, etc. And the name that these are like Lebanese origins, so they're helping the country, but they're putting a strong foothold of the France